Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from the flight deck. We're cruising at 37,000 feet. We just passed over the coast.
Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only
Gator and Denise Show. It's live, it's local, it's tough, straight talk that holds you personally responsible. Welcome to the Dallas Glass and Window Gator and Denise Show, presented by Len Benton Tractor.
Gator, you're a stud. And Denise, you are gorgeous. You look marvelous.
And now, here's Gator and Denise.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Hour 2 gets rolling right now. And as always, glad to have you here for the ride. I want to mention this real quick before we get into our special.
I know.
Third chair
One of my
guest.
favorite guests.
Hasn't been on in a while, but last time he was here, good time.
Could have talked for hours.
It was like 3 history nerds.
I know. Kind of geeking out. We're going to do it again.
Yes. Before we get into that, I want to mention this today. We were talking about, in the previous hour conversation we were having with Ronnie.
Yeah.
And one of the things that came up, and you mentioned Lou Ogden and him running for the Boley position, talking about the trades, CTE, getting people back into that, young people back into that.
So important.
Because for the longest time, you're right, they were on this, it seemed like
everybody had to go to college, whether you needed it or not, or wanted it or not.
And it used to be, I know when I was younger, it was either or.
It was either, when I remember in my yearbook, it was like there were probably evenly split, probably less going to college, actually, and more going into trades, and a lot in the military. That's really changed.
So today at the Boys and Girls Club lunch, I got to eavesdrop into a conversation between two people. One person had a connection with a dairy farm. And knew that this dairy farm was in need of some laborers to come in and work. And by the way, dairy farms, that's hard work.
Yes, very hard work.
I did that in Nebraska briefly.
Did you?
Wow, that's hard.
Ugh.
You're like going, they're cute, they're,
No.
It's hard work. And it's okay. Builds character.
Sure, absolutely.
And the second person in this conversation knew a bunch of guys who were going through a program here locally in Salem who were trying to, get their lives back together. They were getting cleaned up. They didn't have a lot on their resume.
And they were looking for
work. They didn't care what it was. And so these two people, just by chance, had this conversation where she's like, hey, I know a dairy farmer who's looking for a bunch of guys who are willing to come out, work hard, get dirty, make good money. It's not glamorous. It's not sexy. It's just work. And he's like, I got a bunch of guys who are at the point where they've gotten their life back around. They're like, okay, now we need to get back in the workforce. But because of their history, not exactly, going to go apply at an attorney's office.
So they need a second chance.
Right. So they need a second chance. She's like, perfect.
I love that. Oh, I love that so much.
Phone numbers exchanged. They're going to get together later.
I didn't hear that. I was a couple people down, so I didn't hear that. But that's wonderful. That's great.
It was one of those moments where you realize this is the fact that this dairy farmer is having issues with trying to get people to work is for the very reason that our young people, we spent so many years trying to push them to go to higher education that we don't have people who are willing to come out and go, I really don't want to be a rocket scientist. I don't want to be a lawyer. I don't want to be a doctor. I just want to be someone who goes, works hard, feels good about their work, comes home.
Can support my family.
Exactly.
Yep.
And there's a lot of those people out there.
There's
but we
honor in that.
Weren't giving them an opportunity. So now we're having these conversations where older people, and this is good for them, coming out, trying to get their life cleaned up, having a chance to go work on a dairy farm.
Cool. That's a great story.
I had to throw that in because that happened earlier today, and it was one of those moments where you're like, perfect. Coincidence.
Nice.
All right, now to our third chair guest returning to the program after too long of an absence. James Masnov. James, welcome back to the program, sir.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's good to have you.
Always good to have you here. Last time you were here, I tell you what, that was one of those where we had to keep looking at the clock going, we got to wrap this, guys.
Right.
We have an ending time. Today, maybe a similar conversation. You wrote another great piece, sent this to us a few weeks ago. Full disclosure, I read it then, read it again then, and it's been sitting here until you got here.
Okay.
So now it's been a couple weeks. I'm skimming over this again. I'm like, okay, yes.
Oh, yeah.
This combines a couple things that is very dear to both Denise and I. One is natural law, and the other is Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean we endorse everything about his lifestyle. Obviously, there were certain things that were questionable. Sure, he's a human being. He has his faults. But there's a lot of things about what he stood for.
Well, and we were talking about things that are getting lost, historically lost, and this whole piece of his beliefs is sort of being glossed over and not discussed and not taught.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody thinks of Martin Luther King as a champion of natural law.
Yeah.
But it's my contention that he was the most ardent and most important champion of natural law of the 20th century.
Wow.
How so? Get into this. However you want to start with this. The floor is kind of open to you.
Okay. Well, if we were to define natural law by the ideals in the Declaration of Independence, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and any government that is formed that is a just government comes following those rights, that our rights precede that government. That's the exact sort of philosophy that Martin Luther King appealed to. And it's a Jeffersonian philosophy. And it's not often you hear Jefferson and Martin Luther King in the same sentence.
Right.
And you really have to erase history in order to not have them in the same sentence a lot of the time.
So why do you think that is? Do you think it's just neglect, ignorance, or do you think there's a reason why they want to try to separate that from his legacy?
I think it's at least twofold. Natural law, I don't know when it stopped being taught in public schools, but I didn't learn about natural law in public school. I generally don't think it is. I'm sure there are pockets of it, but generally speaking, I doubt that's true. And then you have generations going into higher education who also don't learn about it. And I don't know that it's a bias at the public school level. It may be, I don't know, but certainly at the university level, I would say that it is, because generally speaking, of course, you have university faculty are overwhelmingly left of center, overwhelmingly progressive, and because of that, they tend to have a bias against notions of natural law, biases against the very sort of philosophical framework that underpins the founding of the United States. So they have to do sort of these mental gymnastics then to talk about King and remove natural law. And so what they do is they take the most radical elements of King and they celebrate that. They celebrate the way he ended up protesting against the Vietnam War by 1968 and how he started arguing for more sort of socialist economic policies toward the end of his life. Those things are important to talk about, but it's interesting that it's actually not natural law that undergirds his entire life, his entire career, far more than any of those policies that define the last 1 or 2 years of his life.
Interesting. Just to go back, natural law, like you said, it isn't really being taught. Can you kind of lay it out, break it out a little bit, just to get a broader understanding of what that is?
Sure. So basically it's the idea that the human experience is unique, and that human beings, by their very nature of being sentient beings, they are endowed by certain rights. And you can look at that metaphysically or not. But basically it's just the notion that, well, basically natural law, the thesis is that you really can't have rights without natural law. Because, and this is another sort of problem that progressives, for example, have, is that they often are talking about human rights more often than anybody else, but you ask them to define what human rights are, they can't, because there's no sort of objective standard. Natural law has that objective standard. It says rights come first. You are born with them. Some would argue you have them even before birth, but you certainly are born with them. And so there has to be a compelling interest for the state to take any of those rights away. So that is the gist of natural law.
And even at that point, they really can't take those rights away. Those rights exist.
They exist.
Yeah.
But only through certain mechanisms of like due process.
Sure.
A person's fair day in court can those rights fairly be taken away in any instance.
Right, and that's for, as you mentioned, justifiable reasons. But someone's rights cannot be taken away in and of themselves. They might be denied. Those rights.
We're having this discussion: Second Amendment rights, the right to keep and bear arms to protect yourself. They can go and do an end run. I'm hearing now that there are a lot of you don't have to necessarily abolish the Second Amendment if you can monetarily starve gun manufacturers by banks won't make loans to them.
Right.
So even if that all ceases to exist and they succeed in sort of technically stripping Second Amendment rights, I still have the right to protect myself.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's Abraham Lincoln called it a revolutionary right. The natural rights are revolutionary rights.
Well, and I think King exemplified that as well.
Yeah, and that's where that whole Second Amendment conversation gets kind of tricky. And I always go back to basic definition of bearing arms, you know, the right, because a lot of people, the anti-gunners especially, they get on the side thing of, you know, guns, 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 and guns, and I'm always like, stop. First of all, let me remind you that this had nothing to do with guns. And they're like, well, what do you mean? I mean, I'm like, no. First of all, you don't know your history of the United States. Second, you don't understand the history of the phrase bearing arms. This comes down to, and I always do the simple way to look at the Second Amendment. It's easy. You have the natural right to defend yourself against others, and that's where the comma comes in, and the government. Period.
Right.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter what you use.
Right.
You're getting sidetracked about the choice of what you're using, and you're trying to deny our right that you can't. It's immutable. You cannot deny our right to defend ourselves.
Absolutely. And not to sidetrack entirely into a Second Amendment conversation,
Sure.
but I will pile on a little bit. When speaking of kind of the lack of historical knowledge on this, what really gets me going is when somebody says, well, the founders couldn't have imagined, or the founders didn't mean what they said, they didn't mean what they wrote. But, you know, unfortunately for those naysayers, we have their writings. We do know what they had to say, and we do know that they meant it. Thomas Jefferson, for example, recommended that people take their gun with them when they go for a walk. That way they can exercise their body and exercise their rights simultaneously. You know, you bring that up to somebody who assumes that your historical knowledge is not is equally bad as theirs. You know, they then don't know what to say.
The founding fathers were ingenious in the fact that they don't specifically mention gun, they don't specifically mention musket, they don't mention any inanimate object. They just simply talk about that natural law right, that immutable right that says you have the right to defend yourself. How can we put that in a one-sentence line that cannot be argued against if you leave it in and of itself with what it says?
Absolutely.
And whenever I talk to people when they're anti-gun, I said, okay, let's take guns out of the conversation for a minute. If I come into your house and I start swinging at your wife and kids, do you have the right to defend yourself with me? Against me, with me attacking? They're like, well, of course I do. Okay, that's all the Second Amendment is saying.
Right.
Yeah.
They're like, no. I'm like, no, stop. This is why the founding fathers don't say gun. They don't say musket. They don't say how you defend yourself. They simply say you have the right to defend yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Plain and simple. All right, James, let's do this. Let's take a quick breather, and we come back returning to the conversation about Martin Luther King Jr., the champion of natural law, and how that really should be, as we were talking about earlier today, being the Holocaust Remembrance Day, where we do need to remember this. It wasn't that long ago in our history.
No. And it's being lost, and it wasn't that long ago.
They get sidetracked.
Yes.
And then they hear about these stories, and they're going, oh, well, you know, oh, my land.
Well, I'd like to explore a little bit more, you know, is this unintentional, or is there some rationale to doing this?
I think you know the answer to that.
Too.
We'll discuss that when we come back on 1430 KYKN.
Hey Oregon, I'm America's Digital Pro, Kim Commando. Get the latest for all things digital in my Consumer Tech Update coming up shortly. Now, more of the Gator and Denise Show on 1430 KYKN.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Okay, I just saw something about this. This is bad. This is bad. And now you're making fun of me. Because I just saw something online that the Salem taco crawl, which is coming up, something changed with it. But I'm like, ooh, tacos.
Tacos.
All right, so I need to send my wife a message that I want tacos. And then I remembered she's driving right now, so I'm not going to text her.
So you just sent.
And then I remembered if I want tacos, since I do, I'm like probably going to have to get the tacos.
And I immediately thought of the little chihuahua.
Yeah, you did.
Yo quiero tacos.
No.
Tacos. I'm stopping at tacos.
That's not tacos. That's American something in a shell.
Chalupas or something.
Tacos. Oh,
all right.
Lance. All right, joining us in the third chair, James Masnov, with a conversation about Martin Luther King Jr. and him being the champion of natural law philosophy. I want to expand on this, James, before we move forward. We were doing a little definition about natural law versus,
unnatural law?
Unnatural law, man's law.
Faux law, fake law.
So I want to go through these because we've used this before, and I want to bring this up because this is a good comparison between the two. But natural law versus man's law. Just kind of a refresher course so everyone knows what page we're on. So natural law being based upon principles and truth. Man's law being based upon dogmatic beliefs. Okay? Natural law harmonized with due to knowledge and understanding. Man's law complied with due to fear of punishment.
Feelings.
Natural law, universal, exists and applies anywhere in the universe regardless of location. Yay, Mars. Man's law differs from location based upon the whim of legislators. Moral relativism
Again,
is what I think
feelings.
of. And finally, natural law, eternal and immutable, exists and applies for as long as the universe exists and cannot be changed. Man's laws changes with time based upon the whim of legislators. Again, moral relativism. See, and a lot of people will put this, and I have no disagreement with this, but I have the same conversation a lot of times with people, James, where, we will sit there and say, especially based on our Declaration of Independence, how our country is set up, we have these inalienable rights given to us by our Creator. And people go, well, I'm an atheist, I'm not religious. All right, fine. Everything I just read about natural law?
But even when you put them side by side, who would choose man's law? Given that it's fickle, it's based on the whims of man.
But that gives man control.
Oh, I know. But I mean,
basically the choice is, no matter what your spiritual beliefs or lack thereof, the choice is, do you believe in universal principles or not?
I don't believe in gravity.
Right,
Seriously, doubt it.
Right, but what you were talking about with the moral relativism, that's what you have when you have, as you called it, man's law, or in legalese, it's sometimes called legal positivism, which is the idea that rights come from government, which is a horrific idea as far as I'm concerned.
Horrible.
Yeah, but if you want to leave anything pseudo-metaphysical out of it, which I'm more than happy to do so, then it's a matter of universal principles or the lack of universal principles. So natural law kind of proves its own worth just by its own definition, but just by its own practice.
Yeah.
It's an easy conversation because regardless of whether or not, as you said, James, whether or not you're spiritual, have some kind of religious background or not, you can be an atheist and natural law still applies.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the key. All right, so let's tie this back in. I mean, this piece you wrote is specifically about Martin Luther King Jr. And
could I set the scene?
Definitely.
Okay, excellent. So I think that where this article came out of was a few years ago. My family and I spent some time in Washington, D.C., and I'd been there before. It's one of my favorite cities, largely because of the history. And despite all the evil that comes out of it, it's a beautiful city and it has amazing history. And the King Monument that's there now, it's only been there since I think 2011. And that most recent time that we were there was the first time it was there since I had been back. And it was just astounding as I looked at it. And the monument has King standing, and he's looking across the tidal basin. He's looking directly toward the Jefferson Memorial. And I thought that was really, really symbolic, and it couldn't have been done by accident.
It's intentional.
I don't know who decided to do that, but nothing in that part of D.C. is left to chance. The aesthetics are very important. I mean, this city was built by Masons, who are all about the great architect, and really...
We saw National Treasure with Nicolas Cage.
Right.
I mean, we know all about it.
Who needs to know more than
I saw
Nicolas
both
Cage?
movies, and I never knew that there's hidden passageways behind Mount Rushmore.
But there's symbolism and there's meaning behind everything.
Yes, I'm going to let that one go. But the...
the look on his face is like, oh no.
Yeah,
oh, no.
But the aesthetics in D.C. are very beautiful, and they're very important.
And intentional.
And intentional, exactly. And so not only is King standing there with his arms crossed looking right across the tidal basin toward the Jefferson Memorial, but he's also holding up this rolled up piece of paper in his hand.
Yeah.
And I think most people looking at it would think that it's a copy of one of his speeches, which it might be. But the thesis, part of the thesis of my article is that it could have easily just as likely been a promissory note. Because in his most famous I Have a Dream speech, he references the Declaration of Independence, and he reinforces all of the arguments he makes by asserting natural law principles in that speech. And he calls the Declaration of Independence a promissory note where it has now come time to be cashed, to be paid. And that is so important. So it makes sense that King, holding this rolled up piece of paper that could be the Declaration, is standing arms crossed across the tidal basin to the author of the Declaration of Independence. I think that's very powerful.
So how do we know for sure? I love that idea. When I read this, I thought that completely makes sense.
That got me. Yes.
But just like, the whole, whether it's Da Vinci Code or, National Treasure, how do we find out? How do we know whether or not that is? Because I like that as an explanation, but as you mentioned,
I hope it is.
We don't know that for a fact. There's kind of a mystery about what is it he is holding wrapped up under his arm.
Right. Well, I think what's more important than whether or not that's what he's holding in his hand in the monument, that is what he had in his heart as a human being. And that's far more important, is how he actually argued for these principles in his life. And enough time has gone by that a lot of things about King have been kind of depoliticized, but he was an extremely political figure, a very divisive figure for a number of reasons, and continued to be as he grew more radical and became kind of a pet of the political left in many ways. But I think a lot of people try to hang on to him as kind of an apolitical figure, but doing so, you start to lose any real memory of him. So, yeah, the point in my article was not so much whether or not that rolled up piece of paper really is the Declaration, so much as he lived his life as if that was the Declaration. He symbolically stood with his arm crossed, looking at Thomas Jefferson, saying, okay, it's time. You said all men are created equal, let's act like it.
And live up to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's really the point that I think a lot of people miss about King, was that unlike a lot of activists from the African American community, especially from the 1960s, he was not somebody who rejected the American system. He doubled down on it and said, no, this is the right system. We're just not abiding by it.
Yeah.
Right. And that is key. He wasn't
That's
trying
important to note that.
Absolutely, because he wasn't trying to change what the existing system was, where for the longest time Malcolm X was. He was trying to sit there and say, look, we're just...
He wanted us to live up to it.
Right.
To live up to the promise.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. So, James, with this article that you've published out there, and we want to put, if you're okay with this, we want to put a link up on our page. With
that'd be great.
Okay.
So we'll put up it. We wanted to check with you before we did that. Where do we go with this education? Because it's interesting you mentioned the political angle of Martin Luther King Jr., and I don't know if this is going to be a bunny trail or not, but I think you're right that a lot of people do look at him in a non-political sense, and yet if you study the 1960s, especially a lot of his interaction with LBJ and what led up to the famous civil rights passing that LBJ did and took credit for, a lot of it was because of the pressure that Martin Luther King Jr. was doing politically, pressuring LBJ at the time to follow through with the promise that recently Kennedy had given, and then even more so that he's referring back to, as you said, the Declaration, back with Thomas Jefferson. How do you see his life being cut down short early? But how do you see Martin Luther King Jr.'s viewpoint of natural law, it getting lost in a lot of what our younger people are remembering about him, even people our age, are necessarily tying those two together? I think a lot of people will look at your article and be surprised, especially with the title of trying to tie it in with Thomas Jefferson. You got John Locke in here, and there's some other conversation, other people. It's not something that people normally... What is kind of the reaction you've been getting from people now that this article's out there, especially those who are, I would say, more historically inclined?
Also surprise, because even people who are maybe in the field of history haven't thought about King in this way for a very, very long time, if they have themselves ever, because of how they learned about King.
Right.
And again, it goes back to public school. I don't think that kids should be politicized. And in fact, I have a real problem when kids are politicized. So I'm glad that they're taught King in an apolitical way when they're very young. I think that's appropriate. But I'm afraid that starts the tendency to keep King in kind of this strange vacuum, and act as though he was always held up and praised and lauded and uncontroversial. And he was controversial in the best of ways and in the worst of ways. He was a full human being. So I think that's part of it. I think it's also because just if you talk about the American Revolution, don't often enough, in this case, also hear about natural law. It's the same thing. It's the narrative of natural law that's been lost, whether you're talking about the American Revolution, Martin Luther King, or even Lincoln's reasons for defending the North and asserting the powers of the North during the Civil War. He also doubled down on the Declaration of Independence. So there's some stuff about Lincoln in there as well for that very reason. So I think it's the narrative of natural law being removed that affects all of these things, including Dr. King.
So what is the danger? What do you see kind of looking ahead? What do you see as the danger of us continuing to leave out this whole idea of natural law when it comes to, specifically in America?
Without being melodramatic, everything. Because
dun, 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 dun.
yeah, I know.
Maybe it calls for being a little dramatic about it.
I hesitated because I don't want to be overly dramatic, but if people don't know what their rights are and they don't know where the idea of rights originate from, that's when it's easy for government to tell them, oh, your rights came from us. And because we can give you these rights, we can take them away. And so, philosophy precedes systems. In the article, I talk about the Constitution being a piece of political science, whereas the Declaration of Independence is a piece of political philosophy. It's the philosophy that matters. You have to have stable philosophy before you can set up a system based around it. And so this is something that I continue to return to as an historian and someone who reads and writes about this kind of stuff, because the nature of individual rights is everything. And you can't have a healthy government, a healthy people, a healthy culture without people who know what the rights are and know where they come from.
I think that's absolutely right. If people don't understand that, that's where the health of a nation gets
right, and
jeopardy.
which is where my question comes in. Do you think this is being intentionally done? Is it done out of ignorance? Is it done because it's been generationally not taught, and we're just sort of now looking back and sort of reaping the bitter fruit of not being taught that, or that there was a systematic pulling these things out? Because you're right, it's easier to control the people if they don't know what their rights are, and if they do believe that the government bestows them and then can therefore deign to take them away from you.
Right. Well, I think with over a century ago, with the advent of the progressive era and progressive, the progressive movement, especially in the White House, with figures like Woodrow Wilson, who
Denise's favorite.
Oh yeah, probably
yeah, and that's
probably my least favorite.
Just a terrible,
as well.
Terrible president.
Absolutely awful, and he was, I believe, the first sitting president to just openly talk about how the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were quaint.
Yeah. And they've been an impediment to them all the way along.
And
quaint.
And probably no coincidence that he had been the president of a university.
Princeton,
At Princeton, So I think ever since then, the academic world, for at least 100 years, and it's just become more this way over time, really takes issue with natural law because it gets in the way of their agenda. And I don't mean their agenda like they're scheming in the shadows. I mean, what they are very open and vocal about what they advocate for, which is, a complete redesign of the system of like the economic system and what have you. Natural law really gets in the way of these sort of utopian goals that they have. And so because of that, I think that plays a big role. I think sometimes it's deliberate, and I think it's that sometimes they're just they're more focused on what they want than what the reality is. And I do believe that there's some disingenuous actors who will, how do I put this? They will evade the issue of natural law, say if they're professors or teachers, if it gets in the way of their personal kind of political biases. So I do think there are times that teachers and professors avoid the issue, but I think it's also because natural law is kind of on its face a somewhat controversial idea. Still, because it is radical, and I'm not afraid to say so. The idea that you have rights that come before anything else in the world, including your own government, that is a scary idea to a government that doesn't want you to think that.
and part of that change, especially in the last 100+ years, has been that we have given more of that control over the government when as you know, we all know, we talk about it all the time, the original idea was small government. Mm-hmm. The federal government had like 4 things it was supposed to do.
Yep.
That was it. And we, the people, were going to, for the most part, run our country and run our lives. There were, certain, agreed upon, okay, we're all going to be we're going to vote on this. We're going to make sure we're all in the same. But it was not the federal government. And what's happened over the 250 some odd years, especially in the last 100 years, we, the people, have either intentionally or unknowingly slowly just given away more of the control to the federal government. We're now at the point, James, where it's like, okay, so how do we fix that?
Mm-hmm.
Or can we fix it?
We've got a large swath of the population that values safety over liberty. And so when you can reach that tipping point, I don't know if you can come back from that.
And yeah, you just touched on something that I was going to say, which is that sort of reliance is addicting. And when you raise a generation or more who think that it's more important to be kept safe, whatever that means,
right,
than free, then you're going to have, safe spaces on college campuses where, oh, you don't like what this person says? Well, let me put you in this room and give you some coloring books and it'll make you feel better. I mean, if I had told people 20 years ago that was going to be the end result of what was happening, they would have laughed at me.
Yeah.
They would have had no reason to believe me, but here we are. Mm-hmm. And I think the same sort of idea of rejecting the notion of self-reliance is the same exact issue, whether you're talking about individual rights or you're talking about being kept safe from ideas you don't like.
James, always good to talk to you. Any final concluding thoughts on the entire topic we've had that you want to make sure gets covered before we...
No, I'm good. I appreciate you dropping a link somewhere where people can read this for themselves.
I encourage people to really dig in and read this. It's quite good, and it's fascinating, and it's probably, how many people, did not make that connection between King and natural law. It's an important article.
Just as a sidebar, especially dealing with Martin Luther King Jr., man, there's a whole history, especially the political stuff, in the 60s, leading all the way up to his death. There's a whole political side to him that I think people are not aware of. You're right, and I get it when they're younger, the apolitical. Martin Luther King, he was all for civil rights, and he, blah. Okay, great. But as you get older, there should be more of that, hey, by the way, a lot of these changes were because he went head-to-head with the President of the United States and pretty much forced a racist president to do something based on a previous president that the current LBJ didn't want to do, but figured, I'm in a corner, I've got to do something.
Well, the nuance to treat him as a full human being.
Exactly.
I mean, there's many parts. We're all good, bad, and we've got all these other parts, and to treat him with the same.
That's what I always advocate for as an historian, is teach the complexities.
Yes.
Yeah. Not always pretty, but super, super important.
Yeah.
James, thank you so much for
thank you very much.
James.
Coming again. Let's not make it as long next time. Write something again.
We'll do.
Because that's how we do it. He writes something and we're like, ooh, let's get him on. All right, quick breather. We'll be back with an update from Facebook about your privacy. I kid you not.
Fabulous.
On 1430 KYKN.
And we're back with more of the Dallas Glass and Window Gator and Denise Show, presented by Len Benton Tractor.
I'm not going to tell falsehoods to the American people. I'll leave that to others.
Now, here's Gator and Denise.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Glad to have you along for the ride. We will get that link up to the article that James Masnov wrote. Martin Luther King Jr., Jeffersonian champion of natural law philosophy. Great article.
It's great, and it's about 5-6 pages, so it's not a book. It's certainly a quick. Well, it's not a quick read because you want to take your time reading it. It's very well written. It's extremely well sourced. It's well worth the time to dig into it.
I read it, like I said, I read it once. I read it again. Yeah. I was like, ooh, I like that.
And I actually printed this one out. I like things that I really want to spend time and absorb. I need them on paper. I guess I'm old school that way.
And see, now after this conversation, I'm going to take this, and in the next few days, I'm going to read it again.
Read it on.
Before he was leaving, James kind of sneak peeked a little bit of some plans he's got going on coming up that sound absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
So as soon as we can and we know, we'll let you know more about that.
We'll share more of that.
All right. So speaking of sharing, you just heard Kim Commando talking about the Zuckerberg grilling from the Senate. There's also a clip going around which is comical of all of these older senators asking embarrassing questions about.
What is that? Is it a book of faces? Are there pages in it? Do you turn the pages?
The one guy goes, my grandson is heavily involved in Instagram, and I'm sure he would love the fact that I'm mentioning this because I'm sitting here talking to you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Yeah, your grandson probably doesn't care because your grandson, as you just said, probably isn't even on Facebook. But I digress. So just a few minutes, or not a few minutes ago, before I think the last hour.
Right.
Right before.
I saw you doing something with your camera, facing it at your screen. I'm like, what is he doing?
Because I've got a laptop open here, and I've got social media, because that's how people will communicate. One of the ways people communicate with us during this show. And so I had it open, and one of the tabs is Facebook. And at the top of my Facebook was this notification from Facebook. And I was like, because it's on my laptop, or the laptop in here, I'm like, well, I can't screenshot it. So I grabbed my phone to take a picture real quick in case it disappeared. Because it did. So I'm glad I took a picture of it. Here's what it said. Protecting your information. Uh-oh. We understand the importance of keeping your data safe. We have